Okay, guys, welcome to this live stream. So today we're going to be discussing a an interesting topic, which is what I've titled the battle between God and science, the battle between science and God. Now, sometimes people um, when they, especially in the 21st century, when we talk about God, when we talk about religion, when we talk about science, these, at least science, or God and religion and science, are seen as two opposite ends of a spectrum, two opposite ends of reality. Those that engage in science, those that are scientists, and those that are religious people, they seem to be portrayed as, these two realities seem to be portrayed as two different things. There is no link between the two, right? And what I want to do today is I want to sort of share some thoughts regarding science, regarding religion, in particular Islam, and regarding the link between the two. Is there animosity? Is there disagreement? Is there agreement? Where is the agreement? Does Islam encourage science? If it does, how does it encourage science? What does it mean to be a Muslim, or someone that is a religious person and someone that does science? Can you be a scientist and a religious person, or a Muslim? Or if you're a scientist, you have to be an atheist? I'm going to try to answer all of these types of questions today, and so we can have a better understanding and clarity on this topic. Because unfortunately, sometimes what happens is we see videos or read things from people like Richard Dawkins, whether it be in his books, his TV interviews, etc. And the perception we get, the idea that is delivered to us through his speeches and his writings, and other people like him as well, um, is that we live in the 21st century. We have this method called science. Science is what leads you to truth, and anything that comes from other than science is not something you need to focus on or worry about or be concerned about. Science gives us truth, and that's all that matters. That's the perception, that's the idea that some of these new atheists and people that disassociate themselves from religion and God are sharing. That's the views they want people to have, and that's the understanding that they want people to have. Now, this is not a new phenomenon. This view that these new atheists are pushing was actually a view, I believe, even in the I believe it's in the late 19th, early 20th century, that the logical positivists had. The positivists had which was a movement that promoted the idea that science is the way to truth. Any other knowledge or any other supposed truth is not truth with a capital T, and hence should be neglected or not be taken seriously, or is not of concern. All we need to focus on is what science establishes to be true, and that's it. That's all we need to worry about. And that's exactly the line of thinking and reasoning the new atheists, in particular the naturalist type of atheists, follow. You can call it scientism, which is another term to refer to this view that science is the only way to truth. If science cannot prove it, that thing should not be believed, or that thing does not exist. So scientism is a term that's used to refer to this view. People like Richard Dawkins, I believe even Sam Harris, Dan Dennett, Lawrence Krauss, and to name a few, these individuals, these new atheists, also follow this view. Now, we need to break this down, and we need to really understand what's going on here. And the way I want to break today's discussion down is into two parts. The first part, I want to quickly and briefly look at what the scientific method is. And this will be a superficial study of it, but it'll be enough to get us to appreciate and understand what science is and how it works, and therefore remove some of these misconceptions that people have regarding science. And the second thing I want to look at is, when it comes to Islam and when it comes to religion in general, but in particular Islam and the belief in God, how does this tie in with science? Does religion encourage us to engage in studying the world and doing science, or does it prevent us and stop us from doing this? And if it does encourage us, why does it encourage us, and what's the objective behind doing the science, right? So we're going to look at this, and hopefully when we get an understanding of both of these things, it will give us a clearer picture as to the relationship between science and religion, but specifically science and Islam. So when it comes to science, this view this view that science is the only way to truth. We have science, we don't need any other mode or means of knowing or studying the world. All of these views are incorrect. Science, put simply, is a method to study the physical world. It's a method, it's a tool that we have at our disposal as human beings that we employ to study the physical world around us, right? So what I mean by this is, as human beings, we use our senses and we observe the world around us. We study, we look at the world around us. And through observations, we gather data, we collect data, and then when we have data, we reason upon the data, we reflect upon the data, and based on that, we produce our ideas, our theories, etc. Right? This is a very simplified version or view on what's going on when you do science. Now, therefore, if we understand this, that science is dependent upon observations, you have to be able to make observations and study through observations, then science is limited to what's observable. Hence, science only deals with the physical material world, because we can only, as human beings, study the physical material world, right? We can't study any, our senses do not allow us to access anything beyond this. Now, just because our senses are restricted to the physical and material world, it doesn't mean that there is nothing beyond the material, right? That's another question. We'll touch upon this in a second. So, understanding just this, we realize that science deals with the material. It deals with the physical. So it's a brilliant tool. It's a brilliant method, right? It's phenomenal. The fact that we can do science as human beings, that we can study the world and we can reason upon it, and that the world is ordered to, such a degree that we can actually study it, is in and of itself a very big sign that there must be a creator, there must be God, because how could you otherwise make sense of an ordered universe and an ordered mind that has the ability to understand this universe and unlock the secrets of this universe? It just doesn't make any sense without God. But going back to the point that science is a method which is there, and it helps us and allows us to study and understand the physical world around us. Another point to understand is science does not make claims to absolute truths. Science as a method cannot give you absolute facts. If you study the philosophy of science, you'll realize that science, for example, is based on induction. And induction is a mode of reasoning, if you like, or a way of looking at things, which means, or which suggests that you will always be in the position to induce a conclusion, meaning you only have a limited set of observations at any given time. You don't have an infinite number of observations. Now, let me give you a practical example to really get us to understand this. Imagine you're a scientist and you have been commissioned by your boss to go into the fields of London in the UK and study the birds that fly over the field. And you have to check what color the birds are, right? Now, you spend, say, a year going into the fields of London, and you're sitting there every day with your notepad and your pen, and you're looking up into the sky and you're observing the birds that are flying over. Now, each observation you make, the birds are brown. So you make one observation brown, 2 observations brown, 100 observations brown. After a year, say you have 1 million observations, right? Say you've observed 1 million birds. All of them have been brown. Now, as a scientist, you would go back after a year, because your time's over in the field, and you would make the conclusion that all birds that fly over the fields in the UK are brown. Now, this is a reasonable conclusion to make based on the observations that you have made, based on your study over the year. Because every bird you've seen has been brown. Therefore, your conclusion is that the birds that fly over the fields of London are brown, right? You could even go as far as saying all the birds that fly over the fields of London are brown. This is a reasonable conclusion based on your observations. Is it, however, an absolute fact? The answer is no, because there is always room for error. There's always room for error, meaning that it's possible, maybe unlikely, but it's still possible that maybe if you spent another week, another day in the fields, you may have come across a bird which is white, or you may have come across a bird which is black, or you may have come across a bird which is blue. It could have happened. There's a possibility, there's a chance. There is room for error. And this applies across the board to all of our scientific inquiries, because we never have a total set of observations. We don't have the entire set of observations ever, right? Therefore, it's possible there would always be a bird that flies over the fields which may be white. There may be that rarity. And that means science can never say with 100% truth that something is an absolute fact. You can't. You could say it's a fact with the small f, and it's most reasonable, it's most likely, but it's not an absolute fact in any way, shape, or form. So this is a very important distinction to make and understand, that science deals with what's most probable, what's most likely. It doesn't tell you what's a fact, right? Now, if we understand this, just these two things, that science is limited to the physical world and studying the physical world, and that it's a method, and that it can never give you absolute facts because it's always limited by its observations, and therefore it can only tell you what's most likely and what's most probable. This means that this conception of science that some of these atheists are presenting, that science is the most amazing method, it could tell you about all facets of life, it could tell you about all truths, it could tell you absolute truths, is false. This is just turning science into something more than it actually is. This is misrepresenting science. This is what you call deifying science. This is what you call turning science into a god, right? And in some ways, science has become the god, right? And it's simply not true. A simple study of the philosophy of science, I'm not claiming to have studied it at any great length or any great detail, but just a simple, basic study, reading a few books on the philosophy of science, you will come to understand. And you don't have to take my word for it. Speak to any philosopher of science and they'll tell you the same thing, right? So science is a method. It's a method that's there to deal with the physical world, and it is limited to the physical, and that it can't tell you absolutes. It can tell you what's most likely or what's most probable, right? Hence, it can't tell you about moral truths. It can't tell you what's right or wrong, although some people like Sam Harris would want to suggest that science can tell you what's right or wrong. But it's another topic, we could address it later on. Science can't tell you, it's amoral, therefore. It does not deal with morality. Science cannot tell you or engage with the question of God, right? Why? Well, because God is beyond the physical. God is not a part of his physical creation. Like we said, science can only deal with the material physical realm. And if God is beyond the physical realm, as we believe as Muslims, and as many religions, most religions I would argue believe that God is not a part of his physical creation, but he is the creator of this creation, then he is beyond the physical, and therefore science has no foot in the door when it comes to the question of God. Science cannot directly prove or disprove God's existence. It's impossible. It's absolutely impossible. All science can do is, when we study the world, we study the physical world, it can indirectly possibly suggest that there must be a creator. Why? Because when we study the world, we see the order within the universe. We see the laws of physics. We see the laws of logic. We see patterns. We see these things which point towards a lawgiver, a creator. So science can indirectly support the thesis, which is that there must be a creator. But it cannot directly prove or disprove God's existence. Okay? It's very important to make this distinction. Hence, if we understand this reality about science, now when it comes to the question of religion, in particular Islam, and when it comes to what does Islam say regarding science or studying the world and studying this universe, because remember, science, what we call the sciences, had different terms and were referred to as different things throughout history. We call it science today, but I believe in the discipline of philosophy, it was called natural philosophy at a point in history. And then we chose the term science, etc. So let's take what we mean by science, which is that to study the physical world and the material world and try to understand how it works, and see what Islam has to say regarding this. Now, again, without going into any detail, let's quickly look at, for example, what God says in the Quran. Now, in the Quran, God continuously encourages us to study the physical world, to look into the physical world, to make observations. In a part of the Quran, God says, do you not see the camels and how they were created? In another part of the Quran, God says, indeed, in the creation of the heavens and the earth and the alternation of the night and day, pointing towards the universe and the rotation of the earth and the night and day, God is telling us, do you not see that indeed in these things are signs for people who reflect, people of thinking, people of purity. And to see these signs, obviously, we need to go and study these signs. We need to go and look at these signs God is pointing us towards. Do they not look within themselves, God says? Meaning, look within yourselves, observe the human body, study the biology of the human being. Look at the world. God tells us to travel the world, right? To travel the world and to study it, to look at the world. Look at the stars, right? Look at the sun, look at the moon, look at the clouds. God constantly and continuously refers to these things and telling us, therefore, to look at these things and observe these things and study these things, because in these things are signs for us, right? So what I'm saying here is that if you read the Quran and take any translation of the Quran, you can read the Quran, and when you read and study the Quran, you would see over and over and over again, page and page through, that God is constantly and continuously asking us to study and reflect over the physical world, right? To look at the universe, to study the universe. A very beautiful verse in the Quran, I don't remember the reference right now, where God says that He brought us out of our mother's wombs not knowing anything. He gave us no understanding. We were born into this world as babies, not knowing anything. And then He says He gave us hearing and sight and minds. Very interesting. God says, so He gave us hearing and sight first, or He points out first, which is referring to our senses, right? The ability to hear, the ability to see, right? It's referring to our senses. And then He says He gave us minds or hearts. And here, hearts generally refers to the ability to reason and to reflect. And, generally in the past, the seat of the intellect was known or seen as the heart itself. But that's a different discussion. But the point being is God is referring to the ability to reason and to understand and to reflect. So God is telling us He gave us our senses and the ability to reason, right? So that we may be grateful. That's very interesting. Very interesting. God is saying that He gave us the ability, our senses. And what do we do with our senses? We are to reflect upon the world and to see the world around us and to study it. And He gave us our ability to reason. When we see the world and we make observations, we should reason upon them. And this is very interesting because this is in line with the general definition of science, which is that to make observations, to study, to take in observations through your senses, and then to reason upon your observations, right? So why? As Bertrand Russell says, so that you can comprehend the world, you can understand the world, you can try and make sense of the world. But God tells us He gave us these senses, our senses, and the ability to reason, so that we may be grateful, right? And it's also, and to follow on from this, what's also very interesting is that the very next verse after this, God tells us, have they not seen the birds that are being held up in the sky, that are flying through the sky? Interesting. Now, God has just told us He gave us these senses, He gave us the ability to hear and to see, and now God is telling us to see, to look, to reflect. In the very next verse, He says, do you not see the birds as they're held up in the sky? Right? Study the birds, look at the birds, they're flying through the air. And then God reminds us, none holds them up except Him. Right? Now, this brings me on to another interesting point, which is that some scientists would have you believe that it's enough to understand how things work. So do the science, study the world. When you study the world, make use of the world, meaning that you study it, say you understand how gravity works. You may not know what gravity is, but you know how gravity works, so much so that you can land a spacecraft on the moon. That's brilliant, right? That's amazing. Therefore, that's enough. You don't need to worry about why gravity works the way it does, why it is the way it is. Don't worry about that. You can make use of it, keep making use of it. I would say this is a very selfish way of looking at things, right? And the reason is because in the Quran, for example, God tells us that He made everything in existence subservient to us, right, as human beings. But why? Not so that we can just make the most of it in a selfish way, right? But so that we are grateful to God. We use it, we make the most of it, we benefit from this world and the things in it, including gravity as we're using it as an example, but so that it can inevitably eventually lead us to being grateful to God and thanking God that He made or He created gravity in such a way that we could make use of it. So much so that we could land a person on the moon, right? It's amazing when you think about it. But the scientists would, or some scientists at least, would want you to just And it's fine. It's because the discipline of science is dependent upon methodological naturalism, and it limits itself to the study of the physical world and nothing beyond, which is fine. But some atheist scientists would not want you to even think about or consider the why, right? So they will say, study the birds, as we're talking about the birds in the West. Do you not see the birds are held up in the air? Study the birds, look at the birds, see how they fly, study the mechanism of flight, study the way their wings fold and open, etc., to create lift. Study it so much so that you can now take that information and the mechanics of a bird's flight and then create things and make things such as aeroplanes, right, that fly through the air. And do this, but just do that, and that's enough, right? But I think this is very selfish. Let me give you an analogy to put into perspective what I mean by saying this is quite selfish. Imagine every month someone puts £10,000 into your account. Every month. You don't know who the person is. Now, you may understand how this is working, right? Someone is putting money into your account. The money emerges in your account, and you can take the money out and you can use it, etc., and you can make use of it. So it's beneficial to you. But is that enough for you as a rational, conscious human being that asks questions and is someone that is grateful? Human beings have gratitude. Is it enough to just make use of the money that's coming into your account without inquiring about who put the money there, why they put it into your account? And when you find out that you want to thank this person, of course, you would inquire about these things, right? It's like we say, it's the mark of a rational mind to inquire about that which did not have to be. Why is the money coming into my account? Who's putting it there? Yes, I'm making use of it, but I want to thank the one that's giving it to me, right? That's essentially what the scientists are doing. That's what the metaphor that I've just shared with you is trying to highlight, is that what the scientists are doing, or some of the scientists are suggesting, is gravity works, for example, because we use an example of gravity and anything else by extension. Gravity works. We can make use of it. Brilliant. Just make use of it. Don't worry about why it works or who made it in the way that it is. Right? It's irrelevant. No, of course it's not. As a conscious human being, we would want to thank the one that gave us such an amazing world that we can make use of it. Right? It's amazing. Right? So anyway, without detracting too much from the point, is that when it comes to Islam, God not only encourages us to study the world, but He highlights to us in passages that He gave us the ability to study the world and make the most of it so that we could be grateful, so that we could recognize His signs in this world, which would inevitably lead us to the real purpose of our existence, which is to worship God. That's essentially why we have the ability to study the world, is that when we look into the world, so in other words, when we do the science, when we study the world, it should leave us breathless. It should leave us amazed and stunned that, wow, look at what God has created. And therefore, I should be grateful to Him, right? And I believe this is what many of the Muslim scientists throughout history picked up on. And this was why they were encouraged to do the science. If you look at Islamic Spain, there was a uprising of Muslim scientists in history. And what the Muslims really took to not only studying the world and doing science, but in taking or learning about any information that was there amongst the Greeks, etc., and translating that information into Arabic, because they understood the value of what God had given us, the ability to study the world, right? So they were people who led the sciences at the time. But unfortunately, when we move away from the real purpose of why we were given this ability, and just engage in the world and become all about the world, then these blessings are taken away from us. And that seems to be the case as to what happened in Islamic Spain. It became all about the world. We became too fixated on the world and the riches and the pleasures of this world, and then it was all taken away from us. But this is essentially exactly what people are doing in the West today, especially atheists. They are just worshipping the science, worshipping the method, worshipping the world from that perspective, and not turning to the one and worshipping the one that created all of this and gave this all to us. So, to summarize, if we are to take a holistic perspective of what's going on here, God has given us the ability to do science. He encourages us to do science. Science is an amazing method because it's a method that's there. If we do it properly, it should lead us to God. It should lead us to appreciate the signs of God and therefore turn to God and thank Him. And thanking God is essentially what worship is. We are acknowledging our Creator and thanking Him for the things He's given us. So as Muslims, we understand what science is. It's a method. It's a beautiful method. It's a method that allows us to understand and study the world. What is the world? The world is the creation of God. And in this world are signs of God that when we study it, they bring us close to God, right? They allow us to appreciate God's creative power. That's essentially how we understand science. But the atheists, what they want to do, or some of them, is they want to take this method, they want to glorify it, they want to turn it into something more than it is. Oh, it's the way to all truth. It's the way to absolute truth. We are about truth. Science leads to truth. Forget everything else. Nothing else really makes sense. Religion and science have nothing to do with each other. And then they make these false dichotomies. They present this false picture. Science is progressive. Islam and religion are backward. There is no link between science and religion, right? If you're a religious person, you can never be a scientist, etc. But when you understand science is a method, it deals with the physical world. Within its scope, and therefore you could be a Muslim. And I would even argue, if you are a Muslim and you really understand this aspect of studying the world, you would be encouraged as a Muslim to go out and study the world and become a scientist, right? Not only because you can see the signs of God when you study the world and appreciate that, and this will draw you closer to God, but on top of this, you realize God created you to worship Him. And in this life, one way you can worship God is by studying the world and learning new things and producing new medicine, for example, which can help cure and treat people, because you're helping people. And if you help people for the sake of God, you are worshipping God, right? So it motivates you from that perspective to study the world and to engage in the sciences. And if you look at it from an atheistic perspective, well, there's no real driving factor as to why you should do science in the first place. What does it mean to do science? What does it mean to engage in studying the world? If you're just going to die and become Wormsby? What does it mean to do the science to help the world and make it a better place when, it's all about the selfish gene and just survival of the fittest, right? According to them, right? So there's a lot of issues here and a lot of things we can discuss in future videos. But I guess to summarize, what I'm trying to get at is there's a false narrative that's been painted by some scientists and some individuals like Richard Dawkins, where they're trying to separate science from religion, in particular separate science from Islam. But when you study what Islam says about studying the world and when you study what science actually is, both of these things come together. Now, just as the last point, whenever there is a disagreement between Islam and science, how is this to be understood? Well, simply, number one, science doesn't deal with absolute truth. So it's possible that the thing science is saying may change. It's subject to change in the future. Secondly, science deals with the material, trying to understand the material world. It's fluid, right? Therefore, there may be a current conclusion in science which may go against your understanding of scripture, of what God says in the Quran. And that's, remember, your understanding. Because it may be the verse you're reflecting upon, it may be understood in a different way. It may have a scope of different interpretations. Therefore, science may change. If there is a current disagreement in your mind that there is something that God says in the Quran and it's not in line with science, fine. It's not a problem, because we understand the nature of these two realities. The Quran is revelation from God and is absolute, but that doesn't mean we fully have the ability to understand every single verse completely and comprehensively. Maybe the verse we're reflecting upon, that we're trying to understand along with science, maybe we don't understand it properly. Maybe we haven't studied all of the possible interpretations of that verse. And also, most likely, that what under science understands to be true today may change tomorrow. It's like science at a point in history understood that the Earth was the center of the solar system, right? And that everything, the sun and moon and everything, revolved around the Earth. But that view changed over time, right? So science is fluid. So you can easily be a Muslim and a Muslim scientist and do the science and be a very religious practicing person. Islam does not discourage science. If anything, it encourages science. So I leave you with that, guys. So hopefully that was beneficial. And I really encourage, by the way, those of you that are looking into spirituality, looking into religion, considering Islam, to really read the Quran for yourself. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of things people say about Islam which is not true. So I really encourage you guys to study Islam for yourself, look into Islam for yourself, read the Quran, and the things I've covered today, you'll see for yourself. You'll read for yourself, and give the Quran and Islam a chance, a genuine chance, and give yourself a genuine chance to study the scripture and to see what God has said in His final revelation to humanity. If you have any questions, please leave them below. I thank you guys for watching. If you guys have been watching, if you're Muslim, please make sure to share this with all of your non-Muslims on your pages, non-Muslim friends, on your Facebook pages and wherever else they may be. If you're a non-Muslim and has stayed all the way through, I thank you guys for watching. Please leave your comments and thoughts below. Until next time, take care.